My name is William, and the first thing I noticed wasn't the zombies. It was the road. Route 66 had always been loud in its own way. Tires humming, engines downshifting, the distant rattle of trucks you felt before you heard. That night, it felt like the road had been unplugged. I was driving west just after dusk, following habit more than purpose. The radio still worked, but every station looped the same emergency tone before cutting to silence. No voices. No instructions. Just a reminder that someone, somewhere, had already given up trying to explain what was happening. I turned it off and rolled the window down instead. Cold air rushed in, sharp and dry. No traffic noise followed it. The highway stretched ahead, illuminated by my headlights and nothing else. No taillights in the distance. No oncoming glare. Even abandoned cars were rare at first, which made the emptiness worse. It felt curated, as if movement itself had been quietly redirected somewhere else. That's when I saw the diner. Its neon sign still glowed against the dark, buzzing faintly in a way you could feel through the windshield. Eat. One word lit. The rest of the sign was dead. The parking lot was empty, snow beginning to gather in thin lines along the edges. No barricades, no warning signs, just a building doing what it had always done. Waiting. I pulled in slowly, tires crunching louder than I liked. The sound echoed farther than it should have in the open space. I killed the engine and sat there, hands on the steering wheel, listening. The silence didn't push back. It absorbed the noise and returned nothing. Inside, the lights were still on. That detail stopped me cold. Power meant systems. Systems meant stability, at least for now. Most places I'd passed earlier were dark or flickering, grids failing unevenly. This diner looked untouched. Clean windows, chairs still stacked upside down on tables like they'd been left after closing. It felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain yet. I stepped out of the car and paused immediately. Sound mattered now. You could feel that instinctively, the way your body tightens when you realize the rules have shifted. I closed the door slowly, controlling the latch so it didn't click, then stood still again. Nothing reacted. I crossed the lot carefully, boots leaving shallow impressions in the thin snow. No tracks crossed mine. No old footprints broke the surface. That meant no one had been here since the snowfall started. That meant whatever was happening, it wasn't drawing people toward this place. The door opened easily. Too easily. Warm air spilled out, carrying the smell of grease and old coffee. Familiar. Safe. Dangerous for that reason alone. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, watching the glass carefully for reflections. The diner looked frozen in time. A pot sat on the stove, empty but still warm to the touch. Order tickets hung clipped above the counter. Dates scribbled in pen from days ago. A calendar on the wall still read December. Someone had drawn a smiley face on Christmas Day. No bodies. That was important, not comforting, important. The places where the outbreak had already burned through looked different. This diner hadn't been a destination. No crowd. No urgency. Just a building along a road people had stopped using. I walked to the window and looked out at the highway again. From inside, Route 66 didn't look legendary. It looked fragile. A strip of asphalt waiting for something to justify its existence. Whatever had pulled movement away from it had done so completely. That's when I understood why the diner was still standing. Not because it was strong, because it was irrelevant. No supplies people would fight over, no height advantage, no concealment that suggested ambush. Just visibility from every angle and nothing worth stopping for. In a world where attention got you killed, being ignored was protection. I didn't plan to stay when I walked in. I planned to warm up, maybe take stock, then move on before daylight. But standing there, listening to the hum of failing neon and the quiet ticking of cooling metal, I felt something settle. The road wasn't coming back tonight. Maybe not ever. I turned away from the window and looked at the diner again. Really looked this time. Not as a place to pass through, but as a system that still worked. Heat, shelter, sight lines in every direction. A building designed to endure long hours without change. Outside, the highways stayed empty. Inside, the diner kept doing what it had always done. Waiting for customers who would never arrive. That was the moment I stopped thinking like a traveler and started thinking like someone who had just found a place the outbreak didn't care about yet. I didn't move deeper into the diner right away. I stayed near the counter, hands resting on the laminate, letting my presence settle into the space. Buildings had a way of telling you whether they tolerated you or not. Houses felt personal. Stores felt exposed. This place felt indifferent, and indifference was exactly what I was looking for. The more I studied it, the clearer the answer became. This diner hadn't survived because someone defended it. It had survived because no one bothered with it. Everywhere else I'd passed that night fell into one of two categories: places people ran toward and places people ran from. Grocery stores, pharmacies, gas stations. Those had been stripped fast or burned out entirely. Homes showed signs of panic, barricades half-built, doors left open mid-decision. This diner sat between those instincts. It wasn't valuable enough to attract desperation, and it wasn't threatening enough to trigger fear. That middle ground had saved it. The windows told part of the story. Too much glass to feel safe. Too much visibility to feel hidden. Anyone passing by could see straight through the place in seconds. No shadows to hide in. No corners to ambush from. For people thinking in terms of combat or shelter, that kind of exposure was a liability. They would have kept moving. I checked the storage areas next, doing it slowly, deliberately. Walk-in freezer still cold. Dry storage half full. Nothing impressive. Enough to function, not enough to fight over. That balance mattered. Scarcity attracted people. Abundance attracted crowds. This diner offered neither. Even the location worked against attention. Route 66 wasn't what it used to be. Interstates had siphoned off traffic decades ago. This stretch of road survived on nostalgia and occasional tourists. When the outbreak hit and movement collapsed, the road simply finished fading. No choke points. No bottlenecks. Just empty asphalt stretching between towns that no longer spoke to each other. I stepped back outside briefly and looked again, this time with intent. The diner sat slightly below the road level, just enough that headlights didn't flood the interior unless a car pulled in. Snow had begun collecting along the base of the windows, dulling reflections. From a distance, it already looked closed. That mattered too. Most survivors made the same mistake early on. They tried to look secure: boards over windows, fires for warmth, signals for help. All of it announced presence. This diner did the opposite. It looked like a business that had simply shut down quietly, exactly what thousands of roadside places had done long before the outbreak. Inside, I turned off a few lights, not all of them. Complete darkness created contrast. Partial lighting suggested neglect. The remaining glow softened shadows without advertising activity. From the road, it would look like residual power, not habitation. I tested sound next. Metal surfaces carried noise sharply, but the layout broke it up. Booths absorbed vibration. The kitchen was designed for constant activity, meaning it was built to contain clatter. Even footsteps disappeared faster here than they would have in a house with empty rooms and hard floors. The realization came together piece by piece. This diner wasn't a fortress, it was a blind spot. Zombies didn't linger where nothing happened. Survivors didn't stop where nothing promised safety. The diner existed in a gap between priorities, a place everyone subconsciously agreed wasn't worth the risk. That gap was shrinking everywhere else. I sat in one of the booths and let myself think for the first time since the road went silent. Not about escape. Not about fighting. About sustainability. How long systems lasted when no one pushed them. How long a place could exist simply by not being important. The answer, I realized, was longer than anything else I'd seen so far. I imagined people driving past earlier, glancing at the diner and dismissing it instantly. Too exposed, too ordinary, too risky to sleep in. Those same people probably chose houses, trucks, buildings that looked defensible. Those places would draw attention eventually. This one wouldn't. The diner hadn't been spared by luck. It had been spared by human psychology. When fear took over, people simplified the world into good choices and bad ones, safe and unsafe, useful and useless. This place didn't fit either label cleanly, so it slipped through the cracks. I leaned back in the booth and listened again. The hum of refrigeration, the faint buzz of neon outside. No footsteps, no distant calls, no movement drawn toward me. That was when staying stopped feeling like a delay. It felt like strategy. I wasn't claiming the diner. I wasn't fortifying it. I wasn't turning it into a base that would invite challenge. I was letting it remain exactly what it already was, a place the world had learned to ignore. And in the middle of a zombie outbreak, on an empty stretch of Route 66, being ignored was the strongest defense that I'd seen yet. The first night was when the diner tried to betray me. Daylight made the glass feel like awareness. Night turned it into exposure. Every window became a mirror from the inside, reflecting movement back at me, doubling every motion, exaggerating every mistake. I stood in the middle of the dining area and rotated slowly, watching myself appear and vanish across panes like a ghost that couldn't decide where it belonged. Glass didn't hide you, it advertised you. I killed more lights, but not all of them. Darkness created hard edges. Hard edges drew attention. I needed the interior dim enough to flatten reflections without turning the place into a beacon of absence. I left the kitchen lights on low and shut off the ones over the booths. From outside, it would look like a business left in partial shutdown, not a shelter being occupied. Then I tested silhouettes. I moved past the windows deliberately, watching how my outline behaved. Slow movement disappeared. Sudden shifts snapped into clarity. Even a head turn could register if done too fast. I adjusted immediately, breaking motion into fragments, letting pauses erase intention. The diner responded by swallowing me again. Chrome was worse than glass. Every polished surface reflected light unpredictably, coffee machines, counter trim, chair legs. I dulled what I could with fabric and cardboard, anything to kill sharp highlights. The goal wasn't concealment, it was confusion. Shapes that couldn't resolve into meaning didn't invite interest. I stepped outside briefly, circling the building at a distance. The neon buzzed faintly, not loud enough to carry far, but steady. That steadiness mattered. Irregular sound drew response. Constant sound blended into environment. I left it on. From the road, the diner looked abandoned, closed for winter, too empty to matter. No movement behind the glass. No shadows shifting in response to passing headlights that never came. That was when I heard the first footsteps. They were faint, distant, and wrong. Not the scuff of boots, not the scrape of tires. A dragging rhythm that didn't hurry and didn't stop. I froze behind the counter and waited, letting the sound approach without reacting to it. A figure emerged from the darkness beyond the parking lot, crossing the edge of the diner's visibility. It moved slowly, head angled downward, arms loose at its sides. Snow clung to its coat without being brushed away. It didn't look at the building. It didn't look anywhere. It simply moved. I stayed still and watched through the glass. The figure passed the windows without slowing. No turn of the head. No pause. The diner didn't exist to it. It followed a line of movement that had nothing to do with shelter or light. When it reached the far edge of the lot, it continued on, fading back into darkness without acknowledging the building once. That moment taught me something essential. Visibility didn't always attract attention. Sometimes it repelled it. Places that looked defensible invited challenge. Places that looked active invited curiosity. This diner did neither. Its openness made it uninteresting. Nothing to surprise. Nothing to corner prey. Nothing to react to. I stayed behind the counter for a long time after that, tracking reflections instead of threats. Every time I shifted, I watched how the movement propagated across glass and metal. The diner punished impatience and rewarded restraint. Slow motion dissolved. Stillness vanished entirely. Later, another figure passed. Then another. Both followed paths that curved around the building naturally, as if the diner were a rock in a stream. Movement flowed around it. Not toward it. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I rested in fragments, leaning against the counter, eyes open, breathing shallow. Sleep created uncontrolled movement. Twitches. Shifts. Noise. The first night wasn't for comfort. It was for learning the boundaries of the place. Sometime before dawn, snow began falling harder, softening the world even more. Tracks disappeared almost as soon as they formed. Sound died faster. The diner faded further into irrelevance with every inch of accumulation. By morning, I understood something that hadn't been obvious when I walked in. This place didn't protect me by hiding me. It protected me by making me unnecessary. Nothing needed to come here. Nothing expected resistance. Nothing anticipated opportunity. The diner sat exactly where it always had. Visible, ordinary, and empty of promise. Behind glass and chrome, I learned how to exist without announcing myself. And as the first winter light crept across an empty stretch of road that no longer mattered, I realized I hadn't survived the night by locking anything out. I survived by letting the world pass me by, without noticing I was there at all. Morning changed the diner in ways the night hadn't. In daylight, it stopped feeling exposed and started feeling deliberate. The glass that had worried me after dark now worked like an early warning system, showing the road and the lot without forcing me to step outside. Nothing moved. Snow had settled into a smooth, continuous layer, erasing whatever tracks had existed before sunrise. I didn't start with the booths or the counter. I went straight to the kitchen. Commercial kitchens weren't designed for comfort. They were designed for repetition, heat, and failure tolerance. Redundancy lived in every corner. Multiple burners, multiple prep surfaces, storage stacked vertically instead of spread out. If one thing broke, another could take its place without stopping the operation. That mindset was exactly what survival needed. The grill still held warmth deep in the metal. Residual heat from the night before. Not enough to cook, but enough to prove insulation worked. Thick steel remembered temperature. That mattered in winter. Homes bled heat through walls and ceilings. Kitchens trapped it where it belonged. I checked ventilation next. Exhaust hoods ran upward and out, built to move smoke quickly without pooling inside. That gave me options. Heat without build-up. Short burns instead of continuous fire. If I timed it right, smoke would disappear into wind before it drew attention. Noise was the bigger challenge. Kitchens were loud when used the wrong way. Metal on metal. Dropped utensils. Slamming doors. But they were also designed to handle controlled chaos. Rubber mats dulled footsteps. Heavy appliances stayed where they were put. I padded contact points where needed, turning sharp sounds into dull ones that died quickly. Storage told the rest of the story. Dry goods weren't abundant, but they were organized. Flour, salt, canned vegetables. Things meant to last without refrigeration. Enough to buy time, not enough to invite competition. That balance showed up again and again in this place. The walk-in freezer was still running, but I didn't trust it to last. Power grids failed unevenly, and freezers advertised dependency. I planned for loss from the beginning, moving what I could to insulated storage and treating frozen food as temporary advantage rather than foundation. I worked slowly, methodically, stopping often to listen. Kitchens punished rushing. I let the building teach me how it wanted to be used. Doors closed softly if guided. Drawers slid without complaint if weight was balanced. Even the refrigerator doors, heavy as they were, sealed quietly if handled with patience. I found a rhythm that didn't produce sound spikes. Prep movements without clatter, steps timed with the hum of refrigeration, pauses between actions to let the environment reset. The kitchen responded by staying quiet, by not drawing attention inward. The more I worked, the clearer it became why this place could outlast homes. Houses were built for people to live loudly. Kitchens were built for people to work under pressure without stopping. That difference mattered now more than ever. I tested heat carefully around midday, lighting a single burner for a short interval while the wind outside picked up. The flame stayed contained. No smoke escaped. The metal absorbed warmth and released it slowly after I shut it down. That one action raised the temperature in the kitchen noticeably without announcing itself. It was enough. I didn't cook a full meal. I warmed water and ate simply, keeping scent minimal. Smell traveled differently than sound, slower but more persistent. I opened and closed vents deliberately, letting airflow do the work instead of forcing it. By afternoon, the diner had shifted from shelter to system in my mind. Systems didn't rely on comfort. They relied on consistency. The kitchen could provide that as long as I respected its design. I moved back into the dining area briefly and sat in a booth, watching the road again. Still empty. No figures. No movement. The diner remained a place the world didn't care about. That indifference was reinforced by what I'd just learned. Kitchens like this weren't obvious solutions. They didn't look defensible. They didn't promise long-term safety. They promised work. Most people avoided that. I didn't. Because endurance wasn't about finding the safest place. It was about finding a place that functioned when everything else stopped. The kitchen had been built for long shifts, late nights, and relentless repetition. Winter was just another shift, and as long as I worked with the space instead of against it, this diner could keep doing what it had always done, operate quietly, efficiently, and without drawing a crowd. That was enough to survive the first night, and maybe enough to survive the first winter. Cold became the next variable I had to solve, not because it was immediate, but because it was patient. Winter didn't attack all at once. It waited, testing edges, creeping into joints and decisions until small mistakes became habits. If I was going to stay, I needed warmth that didn't announce itself. Fire was obvious. Obvious was dangerous. The diner offered something better: thermal mass. Steel, tile, thick counters and layered walls built to absorb heat during peak hours and release it slowly after closing. I didn't need constant warmth. I needed controlled warmth, delivered in short, forgettable bursts. I chose the grill first, not the open burners, not the fryer. The grill sat low, shielded, designed to handle sustained heat without flaring. I waited for the right conditions before lighting it. Wind had picked up outside, steady enough to scatter exhaust but not strong enough to howl. Snow fell lightly, softening sound and smell alike. I lit the flame and let it run for exactly 7 minutes. No more. I stayed still while it burned, listening for any change outside. None came. When I shut it down, the metal retained the heat, radiating it outward in a slow, even way. The kitchen temperature rose just enough to matter. Not comfortable. Functional. That became the rule. Short burns. Long release. Smoke was the real threat, not flame. Smoke lingered, clung, remembered. I tested ventilation carefully, opening vents in stages and watching how air moved through the space. The hood system worked silently if handled right, drawing heat upward without turbulence. No visible plume. No scent pooling inside. I closed everything again and waited. Minutes passed, then more. No reaction. That success taught me restraint mattered more than efficiency. Anyone could build a fire. Very few could resist turning it into a habit. Habits created patterns. Patterns invited attention. At night, the temperature dropped hard. Glass bled cold faster than walls. I blocked lower sections with booth cushions and spare fabric, not sealing them completely, just reducing airflow. Trapped air warmed faster than open space. The diner wasn't meant to be airtight. It didn't need to be. I layered clothing and stayed close to heat-retentive surfaces instead of chasing warmth around the room. Steel counters stayed warmer longer than wooden booths. Tile held cold but didn't fluctuate. I arranged myself where the environment worked for me. The mistake would have been chasing comfort. Comfort made you careless. Carelessness made noise. I slept in short intervals, never fully surrendering control. When I woke, I checked windows first, then temperature, then sound. The diner remained unchanged. The road stayed empty. The world beyond continued not to care. On the third night, I tested the oven. Briefly. Carefully. The interior stayed sealed. Heat contained. Exhaust minimal. It worked, but not as cleanly as the grill. I noted it as a backup. Not a primary solution. Redundancy mattered. Heat wasn't just about survival. It was about morale. Cold drained thought, slowed reaction, shortened patience. Managing it quietly preserved clarity. Clarity prevented mistakes. Everything fed back into the same loop. I noticed something else as the nights passed. The diner cooled predictably. No sudden drops, no surprises. That predictability reduced stress. Homes creaked, shifted, protested cold. This place accepted it. It had been built to close at night and reopen in the morning, cycling temperature without complaint. That design choice, made decades ago for convenience, now protected me. Outside, snow deepened. Vehicles along the road became immobile shapes, half buried and forgotten. Zombies that passed earlier slowed further, traction failing them. Cold didn't stop them, but it dulled movement, stretched reaction time. Winter was doing its part. By the end of the week, I no longer thought about heat as something I lacked. It was a tool I applied sparingly, like sound or light. Used too much, it betrayed you. Used just enough, it disappeared into the background. The diner never smelled like smoke. No blackened residue marked the vents. From the road, nothing changed. It still looked like a closed business riding out a slow season. That invisibility mattered more than warmth ever could. Because surviving winter wasn't about staying comfortable. It was about staying forgettable. And as long as the diner released heat without advertising it, I could keep existing here quietly, through the cold, through the silence, through a season that would expose anyone who tried to fight it instead of understanding it. Food was easier to find than safety, but harder to manage. Hunger pushed you towards shortcuts, and shortcuts left traces. In a world where attention meant death, evidence mattered as much as nourishment. I started by inventorying without touching anything. Sight first. Labels, containers, placement. Touch came later when I already knew where everything belonged. Diners were designed for turnover, not hoarding. That worked in my favor. Supplies rotated naturally, meaning nothing had been sitting long enough to rot quietly and announce itself. The rule was simple: consume without footprint. Cooking created 3 risks: sound, smell, and waste. I tackled them in that order. Sound came from preparation more than cooking itself. Chopping, opening cans, sliding pans. I avoided anything that required sharp contact. No knives on boards. No cans popped open carelessly. I used slow pressure instead of force, letting tools do work gradually. Even tearing packaging became a controlled action, eased open in stages instead of ripped. Smell was trickier. It traveled slower than sound, but it lingered longer. I chose foods with low scent profiles. Grains, canned vegetables, bland proteins. No frying, no spices, no sugar burning on metal. When heat was necessary, I timed it with wind and snowfall, opening vents only enough to let odor disperse without pooling. I learned to eat cold more often than warm. Temperature mattered less than presence. Cold food didn't advertise itself. It didn't create steam. It didn't require cleanup that involved water or scraping. Eating became fuel intake, not an experience. Waste was the final danger. Trash told stories. Wrappers crinkled. Empty cans clanked. Even organic waste carried scent. I never let trash accumulate. Each piece was flattened, padded, and stored in sealed containers far from the main space. Nothing went outside. External disposal created trails. Trails invited questions. I repurposed what I could. Cardboard became insulation. Paper wrapped metal to dull sound. Plastic lined contact points. Anything that entered the diner stayed part of the system, absorbed instead of discarded. Eating schedule mattered too. I didn't eat when I was tired or distracted. Fatigue caused mistakes. I ate when conditions were optimal. During wind, during snowfall, during moments when the environment was already louder than me. Hunger waited. Opportunity mattered. The diner made this easier than any house could have. Kitchens were built to hide mess during rush hours. Drains existed, surfaces cleaned easily without harsh sound. I wiped instead of scrubbed, dabbed instead of scraped, let residue dissolve rather than forcing it away. I avoided sinks at night. Water echoed. Pipes remembered sound longer than walls did. Cleanup happened during the day when ambient noise masked it. Timing became as important as method. I also learned restraint, not finishing everything, leaving food untouched so it didn't rot or smell. Taking smaller portions reduced waste and risk. Scarcity mindset killed people faster than hunger ever did. The temptation to stockpile was strong. I ignored it. Stockpiles created attachment. Attachment created panic when something threatened them. Panic was loud. Instead, I treated food like heat, a controlled variable, enough to function, never enough to relax. Days passed like this, measured in quiet meals and careful cleanup. The diner remained neutral. No smells leaked. No trash announced habitation. From the road, nothing changed. I watched zombies pass by again one afternoon, slower now, movements dulled by cold. They didn't stop. The diner didn't interest them. There was no scent to follow, no sound to investigate, no activity to provoke reaction. That confirmed the system worked. Eating without leaving evidence wasn't about secrecy. It was about discipline, about respecting the fact that survival wasn't a single decision, but a series of small ones that either compounded safety or eroded it. People died early because they treated food like comfort. Comfort demanded expression. Expression demanded noise. Noise collapsed space. I ate to remain invisible. By the end of the second week, hunger no longer dictated behavior. Routine replaced it. The diner fed me quietly, and I returned the favor by not announcing that I was there. That balance, consumption without consequence, was what turned this place from a temporary shelter into a safe haven. Not because it had food, but because it allowed me to eat without reminding the world that I still needed it. The first real snowfall changed everything, not because it was heavy, but because it was final. Snow didn't arrive like a storm. It arrived like a decision, a slow, steady accumulation that didn't ask permission and didn't stop to see who it inconvenienced. By the third morning, Route 66 stopped being a road and became a surface. I watched it happen from behind the diner's glass, coffee mug warming my hands without steam. At first, tires still cut dark lines through the white. Then those lines softened. Then they vanished. By the time the sun climbed high enough to cast shadows, the highway looked untouched, as if no one had driven it in years. Vehicles became the first casualties of winter logic. Cars abandoned along the shoulder sank unevenly, tires locked in place by ice. Doors froze shut. Windshields iced over from the inside as much as the outside. Anything that required traction failed quietly. Engines didn't roar or stall dramatically. They simply didn't matter anymore. The diner benefited immediately. Snow erased approach paths. Any track left behind filled in within hours, sometimes minutes. Whatever passed through overnight left no memory behind by morning. That erasure mattered more than barriers ever could. Fences invited climbing. Barricades invited testing. Snow invited nothing. Zombies moved differently once the highway disappeared. Without pavement to guide them, their paths bent and slowed. Ice stole balance. Drifts forced hesitation. Open ground punished uneven weight distribution. They didn't fall often, but when they did, getting back up took time. Time reduced momentum. Reduced momentum meant reduced threat. I noticed they stopped crossing the road entirely after a while. The wide, open surface offered no cover, no sound reflection, no reason to linger. Movement favored edges now, tree lines, buildings, anything that broke wind and held residual warmth. The diner sat just far enough from those edges to remain inconvenient. Snow turned distance into insulation. It also changed sound. Ice and powder swallowed it. Footsteps became soft impressions instead of sharp reports. Metal contracted and complained less when insulated by cold. Even the neon buzz seemed quieter, as if winter had padded the world. I took advantage without announcing it. I moved vehicles deliberately, but sparingly. Not to clear paths, never to clear paths, but to create obstacles. A truck angled across a service road. A sedan nudged into a shallow ditch. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. Just enough disruption that any straight approach would require effort and noise. The goal wasn't to stop anything. It was to slow everything. Slowness revealed intention. Intention could be avoided. As the highway died, so did the habits tied to it. No more travelers. No more curiosity stops. No one pulling in just to check. Snow made detours expensive, and expense killed impulse. Anyone still moving had a reason, and that reason rarely involved a closed diner on a forgotten road. Isolation set in fully then. Not as loneliness, but as certainty. I stopped scanning the horizon constantly. There was nothing coming fast enough to surprise me anymore. Winter had flattened the curve of danger. I tested the perimeter once, walking the edge of the lot during active snowfall. My own tracks vanished behind me as I moved. That feedback loop was immediate and reassuring. Movement without memory, presence without trace. It was the best camouflage I'd seen since the outbreak began. Inside, the diner stayed stable, heat held. Food cycles continued. Systems didn't change just because the outside did. That consistency let me think longer term. Not escape plans, not rescue fantasies, just sustainability under predictable conditions. Snowstorms became my schedule markers. During heavy falls, I allowed myself limited movement outside, repositioning obstacles or checking the building's exterior. Wind and snowfall erased sound and scent alike. Those windows of cover were rare but powerful. When storms passed, I stayed inside. The dead adapted poorly to winter. They didn't freeze solid, but they slowed, attention dulled by the extra effort required to move. Sound still activated them, but distance increased the margin. What might have drawn response from 50 yards now barely carried 10. Snow didn't kill the zombies. It killed the highway. And with it, it killed relevance. Route 66 had once been about flow, people moving through, stopping briefly, then continuing on. Winter ended that flow completely. What remained were static points that either mattered or didn't. The diner didn't. By the end of the month, the road in front of me was indistinguishable from the fields beyond it. No lines, no lanes. Just white, broken occasionally by the dark shapes of stalled cars that had already lost their purpose. That was when I knew the first winter would be survivable. Not because I was strong, not because I was armed, but because snow had removed the one thing that made this place vulnerable. Movement. With the highway gone, the diner stopped being a stop. It became a place the world simply passed around. And in a quiet apocalypse, being bypassed was the closest thing to safety I'd found yet. Cold didn't just slow movement. It rewrote how sound behaved. I learned that the hard way on a morning so quiet it felt artificial, the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. Snow had settled overnight into a dense, crusted layer, and the temperature dropped far enough that metal began to complain in small, sharp ways. The first noise came from inside the diner. A faint tick echoed from the kitchen, quick and brittle. I froze instantly, listening past the sound instead of reacting to it. Metal contracting. Nothing else. Cold pulled structures inward, forcing joints to adjust. Those adjustments created noises that didn't exist in warmer air. The danger wasn't the sound itself. It was the pattern it created. In cold, sound traveled farther along hard surfaces. Ice carried vibration cleanly. Snow absorbed it unevenly. That inconsistency mattered. A dropped object on tile rang out like a bell. The same object landing in snow vanished almost instantly. I began mapping the diner by acoustic risk rather than layout. Metal was the worst offender. Counter edges, chair legs, door frames. Cold made them sharper, less forgiving. I padded contact points further, adding layers of fabric where contraction caused movement. The building grew quieter as I adapted it, but never silent. Silence wasn't the goal. Predictability was. Outside, sound behaved strangely. Wind stripped higher frequencies away, leaving only low vibrations that rolled across open ground. Footsteps sounded closer than they were. Distant impacts felt immediate. Zombies responded differently too. In cold, they reacted more slowly, but when they did react, they oriented more precisely. Sound gave them clearer vectors. I tested this once, deliberately, during active snowfall. I scraped my boot lightly against an exposed patch of ice near the back of the lot. The sound cut cleanly through the air, sharper than I expected. A figure near the tree line lifted its head immediately and took a single step toward the source. When I stopped, it stopped too, frozen mid-shift. That confirmed it. Cold, sharpened signals. Sound didn't get louder, It got cleaner. Inside the diner, I changed how I moved. Sliding replaced lifting. Contact replaced separation. I kept at least one point of contact with padded surfaces at all times, letting vibration bleed away gradually instead of snapping free. Even breathing changed. Cold air dried the throat faster, making involuntary coughs more likely. I managed it with water, sipped slowly. Never gulped. Night was the worst. Temperatures dropped fast after sunset, and with them came more internal noise. Pipes clicked, the neon buzzed irregularly. Ice crept along window frames with faint crackles. I learned to listen for those baseline sounds, using them as cover when movement was unavoidable. Movement without cover was no longer an option. I also learned when not to move. There were nights when the air felt too still, when sound hung longer than it should have. On those nights, I stayed in place completely, letting the world pass through its quiet phase without interference. Survival wasn't about constant optimization. It was about choosing when not to act. Zombies changed in winter too. They didn't group up the way they had earlier. Cold stretched their responses, making coordination less likely. Some froze in place for hours, joints stiffening until gravity shifted them slightly. When they fell, the sound carried farther, but the aftermath was static again. Reaction burned out faster in cold. The diner's glass behaved differently now as well. Cold reduced glare but increased reflection at certain angles. I adjusted lighting again, dimmer and more uneven, preventing clean silhouettes from forming. From outside, the place looked dull and flat, another closed business swallowed by winter. The lesson became clear over time. In cold, you didn't fear loud noises. You feared distinct ones. Anything sharp, anything sudden, anything that broke the ambient texture of the environment. Those were the sounds that mattered. Those were the ones that pulled attention across snow and ice with unsettling efficiency. By the end of the first month, my movements had slowed even further. Not from fatigue, but from precision. I stopped thinking in terms of distance and started thinking in terms of surfaces. Where sound would die, where it would carry, where it would betray me. The diner adapted with me. Fabric softened metal. Snow insulated everything. The building and the season aligned into a single system that worked as long as I respected its limits. Cold punished impatience, but it rewarded understanding. And once I understood how sound moved through winter, I stopped being afraid of the quiet. Because quiet wasn't absence. It was structure. And inside that structure, if you moved the right way, you could survive without ever being noticed. By midwinter, I stopped expecting anyone to return. At first, the hope lingered quietly in the background, not as belief, but as habit. Roads existed to be used. Buildings existed to be entered. That assumption took time to die. Route 66 finished killing it. Snow didn't just erase tracks, it erased intention. Anyone still moving chose routes that minimized risk, and this stretch of road offered nothing but exposure. No fuel, no supplies worth detouring for, no shelter that looked defensible. The diner, once a beacon for tired travelers, now sat like a question no one wanted to answer. I watched the horizon daily, not with urgency, but with routine. Morning light, afternoon shadow, dusk flattening everything into grey. Nothing changed. No distant figures cut across the road. No smoke rose from beyond the hills. The absence wasn't sudden. It accumulated day after day until it felt permanent. The few zombies that wandered near early on stopped appearing as winter deepened. Without traffic, without sound, without fresh disturbance, there was no reason for them to linger. Cold slowed them. Snow redirected them. They drifted toward older noise anchors, towns, intersections, collapsed vehicles. and left this place behind. The diner benefited from that abandonment in a way fortifications never could. Walls invited testing. Defenses invited curiosity. This place offered neither. From a distance, it looked closed, cold, and unimportant. From up close, it offered no advantage that justified the risk of stopping. I thought about how people made decisions under pressure. They chose what looked strong, what looked hidden, what looked temporary enough to escape from. The diner looked permanent in the wrong way. Fixed, exposed, impossible to defend if discovered. That perception turned it into a blind spot. Even scavengers wouldn't come here. Anyone still active avoided wide-open areas where sound travelled cleanly and mistakes couldn't be concealed. They chose towns, forests, warehouses, places where clutter softened error. This stretch of Route 66 had none of that. It punished hesitation and rewarded nothing. Winter sealed that judgment. The neon flickered less as temperatures dropped, finally dying one night without ceremony. I didn't replace it. Darkness suited the place better now. Without the sign, the diner lost its last suggestion of function. It became another closed business swallowed by the season. Power failed in stages after that. Lights dimmed, then went out for good. Refrigeration followed. I adapted quietly, shifting food strategies without complaint. Failure didn't announce itself. It simply arrived and stayed. That pattern mirrored everything else about the world now. No one came because no one was looking. Search assumed rescue. Rescue assumed coordination. Coordination required communication, and communication required sound or signal. Those systems had collapsed elsewhere, loudly at first, then quietly. What remained were individuals moving carefully through a world that punished visibility. I realized something else as weeks passed. Even if someone had passed nearby, they wouldn't have stopped. Stopping created noise. Noise created attention. Attention ended survival. The diner offered nothing that justified that trade. Warmth could be found elsewhere. Shelter could be improvised. This place sat too exposed, too honest about what it was. That honesty protected it. The absence of return wasn't a failure. It was confirmation. Every day without interruption reinforced that the strategy worked. Irrelevance scaled better than strength. The more the world collapsed, the less this place mattered. And the less it mattered, the safer it became. I stopped marking days after that. Time only mattered in relation to systems. Food cycles, weather patterns, physical condition. Calendar dates belonged to a louder world. Winter didn't care what day it was. At night, I sat near the window and watched snow erase the last hints of the road. The line between highway and land vanished completely. Route 66 became just another field, indistinguishable from everything around it. The idea of travel lost meaning here. No one came back because there was nothing left to come back for. The diner wasn't abandoned, in the dramatic sense. It was simply bypassed by every logic that still functioned. The world had narrowed its priorities, and this place fell outside all of them. That was the final gift Winter gave me. Not isolation, confirmation. As long as I stayed quiet, stayed irrelevant, stayed aligned with the environment instead of fighting it, this place would remain invisible to everything that still moved. Why no one came back wasn't a mystery anymore. They didn't come back because they never needed to. And in a world where need dictated motion, being unnecessary was the safest state I could imagine. Time used to announce itself in this place. The bell over the door. Orders called out. Coffee refilled on instinct. When those cues vanished, time didn't stop. It dissolved. Without customers, the diner lost its rhythm, and with it, the easy markers that kept days from bleeding into each other. I had to rebuild time deliberately. At first, I tried counting days. That failed quickly. Days were abstract without contrast. Snowfall blurred mornings into evenings. Overcast skies flattened noon into dusk. What mattered wasn't what day it was, but whether the system still worked. So I stopped tracking dates and started tracking processes. Heat cycles became mornings. Food prep became midday. Perimeter checks became evening. Rest became night. Time reorganized itself around function instead of clocks. The diner didn't care what hour it was. It cared whether things were done quietly and in order. I found an old wall clock behind the counter, battery-powered and forgotten. It still worked, ticking faintly if you stood close enough. I didn't hang it where I could see it constantly. That would have turned it into noise. Instead, I placed it in the storage room and checked it once a day, briefly, to prevent drift. Enough structure to keep me anchored, not enough to become a fixation. Routine replaced urgency. Every morning I walked the interior in the same slow pattern, touching nothing unless necessary. Windows first. Reflections. Snow depth against glass. Then the kitchen. Temperature, smells, surfaces. Finally, storage. Inventory without counting, just confirming absence of rot or failure. The process took time, and that was the point. It created continuity. Without customers, productivity lost meaning. There was nothing to rush for, nothing to impress. That void could swallow you if you let it. I filled it with maintenance instead. Not improvement. Maintenance. Preserving what already worked mattered more than optimizing anything new. I cleaned surfaces even when they weren't dirty. Quietly. Slowly. The act wasn't about sanitation. It was about grounding. Repetition without outcome steadied the mind. It prevented spirals that led to unnecessary movement or noise. I also learned to stop early. In the old world, diners ran until the last customer left. Now, pushing past mental fatigue created risk. When focus dulled, hands slipped. Slips made sound. Sound erased margins. I ended tasks the moment precision dropped, even if that meant leaving something unfinished until conditions improved. Rest became intentional too. Not sleep exactly, but stillness. Sitting in a booth with my back against the wall, eyes open, listening to the building settle. The diner had its own cadence. Metal contracting, wind shifting snow, distant structural noises from elsewhere along the dead highway. Learning that cadence let me distinguish normal from dangerous. Keeping time also meant managing memory. Without customers, the diner became a mirror. Every empty booth invited recollection. Every counter space reminded me of voices that used to fill it. Letting those thoughts run unchecked drained focus. I learned to interrupt them gently, returning attention to tasks instead of stories. I stopped imagining future customers entirely. That fantasy created expectation. Expectation created disappointment. Disappointment created noise in the mind that bled into action. The diner wasn't waiting for people anymore. It was waiting for weather. The most important adjustment was accepting that nothing needed to happen. In the old world, inactivity meant failure. Here, inactivity was success. If a day passed without incident, without repair, without reaction, that was a good day. Counting those days differently changed everything. Success became invisible by design. I marked weeks by storms instead. The third heavy snowfall, the second week without power, the first time ice sealed the door overnight. These were milestones that mattered. They told me the environment was still predictable, still working within understood limits. Without customers, the diner revealed its other purpose. It wasn't just a place to serve food. It was a container for time itself, a space where hours could pass without forcing decision, without demanding attention. That containment protected me as much as walls or snow. By midwinter, my internal clock had adjusted completely. I woke when light changed, not when a schedule said I should. I ate when conditions allowed, not when hunger insisted. I rested when focus thinned, not when exhaustion forced it. Time stopped being something I chased. It became something I managed quietly. And in a world where noise marked the end of things, managing time without customers meant the diner stayed what it needed to be, a place where nothing happened. And because of that, nothing came looking. Nay, as long as I respected that rhythm, winter could pass without forcing a decision I wasn't ready to make. Silence kept the world away. Routine kept me intact inside it. The hardest part of staying wasn't being alone. It was being seen. The diner sat in open country, surrounded by snow and sky, with nothing tall enough nearby to block sightlines. From the road, from the fields, from the low hills in the distance, the building was visible from almost every angle. That exposure had kept people away. Now it tested me in a different way. I learned quickly that visibility didn't equal danger. Activity did. From inside, I could see everything. The long stretch of Route 66 in both directions, the empty lot, the stalled vehicles frozen where winter caught them. That awareness tempted constant observation. Watching felt productive. It wasn't. It drained attention and created habits that led to mistakes. So I limited it. I chose specific windows and specific times. Morning light for perimeter checks, late afternoon for horizon scans. Everything else stayed covered or ignored. Curtains weren't for hiding. They were for reducing decision-making. Fewer visual inputs meant fewer impulses to react. The irony was constant. I was safest when I looked abandoned. That meant no silhouettes. No repeated movement behind the glass. No patterns that suggested life inside. I moved away from windows unless I was actively observing, and even then I stayed low and slow, letting my outline dissolve into reflections and grime. At night, visibility became psychological pressure. The diner's glass reflected darkness back at me, turning the outside world into a void that felt watchful even when it wasn't. I countered that by changing angles, never standing directly in front of a pane. Angled light and partial cover broke symmetry. Symmetry attracted the eye. Zombies passed occasionally during the first weeks of winter, moving along routes that had nothing to do with the diner. They never looked toward it. Not once. Their heads stayed angled towards sound, not sight. That fact should have reassured me. Instead, it reinforced discipline. Sight might not matter to them, but it still mattered to me. Seeing danger without engaging it was exhausting. I learned to let movement exist without tracking it. A figure crossing the far edge of visibility didn't require response. Response created noise. Noise invited consequence. The diner worked because it allowed things to pass without interaction. I had to adopt the same rule internally. Some days I didn't look outside at all. Those were the easiest days. The world didn't need monitoring every moment. It needed respect. The more I watched, the more I imagined contingencies that didn't exist yet. Imagination accelerated the mind. Accelerated minds rushed. Rushing broke silence. I thought about how storefronts used to function. Visibility was the goal. Big windows, bright lights, open doors. Everything designed to invite people in. That logic had inverted completely now. Being visible was only safe if nothing about that visibility suggested value or activity. The diner struck that balance naturally. Dust on the windows, snow piled unevenly along the base. No fresh tracks, no consistent light pattern. It looked forgotten. Not hidden. That distinction mattered. I worked hard not to undo it. I resisted the urge to clean the glass. Cleanliness suggested maintenance. Maintenance suggested occupation. Occupation suggested opportunity. I let grime accumulate naturally, softening reflections further. Even during storms, when visibility dropped to almost nothing, I didn't change behavior. Storms ended, patterns remained. Consistency mattered more than momentary advantage. The mental strain came from knowing that if someone did see me, another survivor, desperate or reckless, it wouldn't be the zombies that posed the immediate threat. It would be the noise that followed interaction. Voices raised, doors opened, movements multiplied, attention converged. That possibility made solitude safer than connection. I stopped imagining conversations, stopped rehearsing explanations, stopped wondering what I'd say if someone knocked on the door. Planning for that moment made it more real than it needed to be. Reality had taught me that fewer options preserved more safety. Visibility without company meant accepting that being seen didn't require being acknowledged. I existed here the way mountains exist along highways, noticed but ignored, passed without comment. That was the role that kept me alive. As winter pressed on, the diner became a fixed point in a world that kept losing them. People, vehicles, signals, all thinned out. What remained were structures that didn't demand engagement. The diner was one of them, and as long as I didn't turn visibility into invitation, as long as I remained just another static shape in a frozen landscape, the world would continue to look past me. Being seen was unavoidable. Being interesting was optional. I chose not to be. The thought didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in during quiet moments when nothing went wrong and nothing demanded attention. Comfort, even restrained comfort, had a way of suggesting motion. The diner worked. Winter had slowed the world. Systems were stable. That stability whispered the same dangerous idea every survivor eventually heard. You could leave now. It started with small justifications, a short scouting trip, a look at the nearest town. Just enough movement to confirm what I already suspected. Curiosity dressed itself up as preparation, and preparation felt responsible. The mind was good at that, turning risk into logic if you let it speak long enough. I noticed the temptation most when the weather cleared. After storms, the air sharpened. Visibility stretched for miles. The world looked open again, almost inviting. Tracks stayed visible longer before filling in. Sound carried cleanly but predictably. Those were the conditions that made movement feel possible, even reasonable. That was when leaving became most dangerous. I stood at the door more than once, hand resting on the handle, listening to the quiet beyond it. Nothing moved. Nothing reacted. The diner felt solid behind me, a known quantity. Outside was unknown, but the unknown had a pull of its own. Motion promised answers. Staying meant accepting uncertainty indefinitely. I stepped back every time, because I'd seen what movement did to people who acted on impulse. Vehicles abandoned at awkward angles, supplies dropped mid-carry, decisions interrupted because sound drew something closer than expected. The world outside didn't punish curiosity immediately. It punished it eventually when patterns formed and margins collapsed. Leaving wasn't a single action, it was a chain of them. Open the door, step onto snow, leave tracks, create scent, make sound, cross open ground, encounter something unpredictable. Each link added exposure. The diner broke that chain by keeping me still. I also understood something else by then. The diner wasn't trapping me. It was filtering the world. From here, danger arrived diluted, slowed by distance, snow, and irrelevance. Leaving would concentrate it again, compressing risk back into every decision. Staying allowed time to do what force couldn't. Reduce threat through neglect. The hardest part was imagining survival elsewhere. Movement suggested agency. Staying suggested waiting. Waiting felt passive, even though it wasn't. The discipline required to remain still, to resist false urgency, took more effort than traveling ever had. That effort didn't look heroic. It looked like nothing happening. I reframed the choice deliberately. Leaving wasn't progress. It was a reset. It would erase everything the diner had given me, predictability, insulation, invisibility, and replace it with variables I couldn't control. Progress here meant deepening alignment with the environment, not outrunning it. I tested that alignment instead of leaving. I tightened routines, reduced unnecessary checks, let days pass without intervention. The diner responded by staying quiet, staying uninteresting. That feedback loop confirmed the decision better than logic ever could. One afternoon, movement appeared far down the road, a shape crossing from one snow-covered field to another. I watched it for a long time. It never turned towards the diner. Never slowed. Never reacted to the building at all. It moved along an old noise anchor I couldn't hear from here. That was the proof. The world had reorganized itself, and this place sat outside the new flow. Leaving would mean stepping back into it. I thought about the people who survived by constantly moving, convinced that motion itself equaled safety. They burned energy, made noise, left trails. Eventually, something followed one of those trails far enough to matter. Staying erased trails faster than they could be made. The temptation faded gradually, replaced by acceptance. I wasn't waiting for rescue. I wasn't hiding out of fear. I was choosing the option that reduced risk over time instead of amplifying it. The diner didn't promise forever. It promised now, extended as long as conditions allowed. That was enough. As winter deepened and days shortened further, the door stayed closed. Snow piled against it, sealing the choice physically as well as mentally. Leaving became harder. Not because I couldn't, but because there was no reason left to justify it. The outbreak had taught me its most important lesson quietly. Survival wasn't about finding the moment to move. It was about knowing when not to. And on an empty stretch of Route 66, inside a diner the world had forgotten, staying put wasn't stagnation. It was the reason I was still alive when the first winter began to loosen its grip. The power didn't fail all at once. It sagged first, subtle enough that I almost missed it. The lights dimmed slightly during the night, and not flickering, just losing confidence. The hum from the walk-in freezer changed pitch, lower and uneven, like something breathing through resistance. By morning, I knew the advantage I'd been borrowing was about to end. I didn't panic. Panic was loud. I stood in the kitchen and listened, letting the building tell me what was happening. Refrigeration systems had a language of their own. When they were healthy, the sound stayed consistent. When they were dying, they complained softly before giving up. This was the latter. The grid had been unreliable for weeks. Winter stress was finishing the job. I treated the failure like a scheduled event instead of a disaster. The freezer still held cold, but not for long. I didn't open it immediately. Opening would accelerate loss. Instead, I planned. What mattered wasn't saving everything. It was deciding what could transition quietly and what needed to be consumed or abandoned without drama. I waited until the afternoon wind picked up before acting. When I opened the freezer door, I did it slowly, controlling the seal so it didn't release with a pop. Cold air spilled out, dense and dry. I worked quickly but carefully, selecting items that could survive temperature change without announcing themselves. Frozen vegetables went first, wrapped and insulated. Meats came next, divided into small portions so nothing required repeated handling later. I ignored the temptation to cook everything at once. That would have created smell, heat, and waste. Instead, I treated thawing as a process, not an emergency. One portion at a time. One decision at a time. So. By evening, the freezer's hum faded completely. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, like a system shutting its eyes for good. I closed the door and didn't open it again. What remained inside would stay frozen for a while, then spoil quietly. I accepted that loss immediately. Clinging to it would only create noise later. I shifted strategy without ceremony. Cold storage moved to insulation. Snowbanks outside became thermal buffers, but I never buried supplies directly. That created patterns. Instead, I layered materials: fabric, cardboard, dead air, using the diner's structure to slow temperature change. It wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. It only needed to buy time. Food choices changed. I ate simpler, colder, less often. Hunger sharpened focus without weakening me yet. Comfort was gone, but comfort had never been the goal. Function was. I noticed how the diner responded to the change. Without the freezer running, the building grew quieter overall. One less machine vibrating. One less sound profile to manage. Silence deepened, and with it, safety increased. Losing power removed a liability as much as it removed convenience. Outside, nothing reacted. Zombies didn't notice the shift. They didn't smell food thawing slowly. They didn't sense the absence of electricity. The world beyond the windows remained uninterested, continuing its slow drift away from places like this. That reinforced the lesson I'd been learning since the road went quiet. Systems were temporary, behavior was permanent. I adapted my routines to match the new reality. Shorter prep times, fewer movements, more stillness. The diner accepted those changes without complaint. It had already survived decades of closures, ownership changes, and seasonal neglect. One more adjustment didn't break it. The hardest part wasn't the loss of refrigeration. It was letting go of the illusion of control it provided. Electricity made you feel anchored to the old world. Without it, everything became more honest. You worked with conditions instead of assuming technology would buffer mistakes. I slept closer to the kitchen after that, not for warmth, but for awareness. If something failed further, I wanted to know immediately, quietly, without surprise. Surprise made sound. Preparation prevented it. Days passed without incident. Food diminished slowly but predictably. Nothing spoiled dramatically. Nothing drew attention. The diner remained unchanged from the outside, a closed business waiting out a bad season. When the last of the frozen food transitioned fully into memory, I didn't mark the moment. There was no line crossed, just another system ending the way everything else had, gradually, without spectacle. The freezer had bought me time. Losing it didn't end survival. It refined it. I wasn't surviving because of what I had anymore. I was surviving because of how little I needed. And as winter pressed on outside, deep and quiet, the diner stayed exactly what it had become, a place that endured by letting go of anything that tried to make it louder than it needed to be. By the time the freezer stopped mattering, something else had changed. The diner no longer felt like a place I was using. It felt like a shape I had merged with. That shift didn't happen through effort or intention. It happened because the world outside had started treating the building the same way it treated everything else that survived the winter. By forgetting it. Snow piled higher against the walls, softening angles and burying the base of the windows until the diner looked shorter, older, less defined. Wind polished the glass with grit and frost, dulling reflections further. The roofline lost contrast against the sky. From a distance, the building no longer stood out as architecture. It looked like terrain. That mattered. Zombies moved through the area less, and when they did, they behaved as if the diner were a hill or a fence, something to move around, not toward. They followed sound remnants embedded in the landscape, not structures. The diner had no sound history anymore. Whatever noise it once produced belonged to another season. I adjusted to that invisibility by doing less, not more. No unnecessary movement near windows. No exterior checks unless weather covered them. I let snow decide when I could move instead of forcing opportunities. When storms came, I stayed still. When wind rose, I used it sparingly. The building responded by staying quiet, blending further with each passing week. My own presence began to feel diluted. Tracks disappeared behind me almost instantly. Heat dissipated without smoke. Smell never accumulated. Even memory faded. I stopped thinking of the diner as a shelter and started thinking of it as a condition, like winter itself, something you lived within, not inside. I noticed how animals treated the place. Small tracks appeared near the edges sometimes. Rabbits, maybe foxes, never close enough to touch the walls. They didn't linger. The building didn't offer food or warmth to them. It didn't alter their routes. That neutrality was a good sign. Wildlife avoided places that changed behavior. The diner didn't. I mirrored that behavior consciously. I stopped modifying the space unless something broke. No improvements, no additions. Any change risked altering how the building interacted with weather, sound, or sight. Preservation meant leaving it alone as much as possible. Days passed where I did nothing beyond basic maintenance. Eat. Rest. Listen. Let the environment do the rest. The absence of activity became the point. Each quiet day reduced the diner's profile further. Each storm pressed it deeper into irrelevance. I thought about other survivors then, if any were still out there, people moving constantly, burning calories and attention, leaving trails they didn't know how to erase. The contrast was stark. Movement created narrative. Narrative created memory. Memory created return visits. From zombies. From other people. From risk. I had none of that here. The diner didn't tell a story anymore. It existed the way closed roadside places always had. Unremarkable, unchanging, passed without comment. That anonymity scaled better than any defense I could have built. As winter wore on, even my internal sense of ownership faded. I stopped saying my diner in my head. Possession implied investment. Investment implied loss if something changed. This place wasn't mine. I was simply not disturbing it. That mindset changed how I thought about survival entirely. I wasn't holding ground and I wasn't defending territory. I was occupying a low-energy state that required no response from the world. The diner survived because it asked nothing of its surroundings. I let go of the idea of milestones. No counting days, no waiting for signs. The landscape dictated pace now, and I followed it. When snow fell, I stayed still. When sun warmed surfaces briefly, I adjusted insulation. When cold deepened, I layered clothing and reduced movement. Each decision aligned with the environment instead of opposing it. At some point, I realized I hadn't checked the road in days. Not because I was afraid to, but because there was nothing to check. The road no longer existed as a route. It was just a strip of ground indistinguishable from everything around it. Route 66 had finally become what winter intended. Silent. Flat. Irrelevant. The diner had followed. Becoming part of the landscape didn't mean disappearing completely. It meant losing priority, losing contrast, losing the qualities that drew reaction. In a world ruled by response, the safest state was to be something that didn't require one. As spring hinted at itself far off, still buried beneath weeks of cold, I understood that survival here hadn't come from strength or foresight. It came from alignment. I had let the place become what winter wanted it to be, and in doing so, I had become something the outbreak didn't notice. I was still alive not because I had outlasted danger, but because I had slipped beneath it. The diner didn't protect me by standing firm. It protected me by sinking quietly into the world around it, until nothing bothered to remember it was ever there at all. Spring arrived without ceremony, the way everything did now. Snow retreated in patches rather than all at once, revealing dull ground that looked more tired than renewed. The air softened, but it didn't warm enough to suggest comfort. Meltwater traced slow paths through the parking lot, carrying grit and memory away without asking what it belonged to. Nothing else changed. That was the first lesson spring taught me. Seasons still turned, but systems didn't reset. Whatever had broken during the outbreak stayed broken unless someone deliberately repaired it, and there was no one left who could do that loudly. The world didn't restart. It simply thawed. I watched the road reappear piece by piece. Painted lines surfaced beneath thinning ice, cracked and faded. Vehicles emerged from drifts like artifacts, doors hanging open, interiors ruined. Route 66 looked usable again, but it wasn't alive. No engines returned. No distant movement tested the asphalt. A road wasn't a road without intention behind it. The diner didn't change its posture. Glass stayed dull. The sign stayed dark. Snowmelt ran along the base of the walls and disappeared into ground that didn't care what it touched. From the outside, the place still looked closed for good. Another business that hadn't survived the winter economy. That illusion mattered more now than it ever had before. Zombies reacted differently in spring, but not the way people expected. They moved more easily, joints loosening as cold retreated. Sound carried farther again without snow to absorb it. But their patterns didn't evolve. They still responded only to interruption, still gathered around old noise anchors, still ignored places that offered nothing new. The diner offered nothing. I tested movement carefully during early thaws, stepping outside only when wind masked sound. Tracks lasted longer now, which made restraint even more important. Winter had forgiven mistakes quickly. Spring remembered them. That shift forced another adaptation. Less movement, shorter exposure, more patience. The idea of rescue crept in quietly during those first warm days. Helicopters belonged to spring, convoys belonged to roads without ice. That hope felt logical, which made it dangerous. Logic had failed the loud world first. I never saw anyone. No smoke columns rose, no distant engines broke the quiet. Whatever survivors existed were doing exactly what I was doing. Staying small, staying silent, staying out of sight. Large-scale rescue required coordination and visibility. Visibility still killed. The hardest part of spring wasn't hunger or exposure. It was resisting the urge to change what already worked. Warm air made fire tempting again. Longer days suggested activity. I ignored both. Comfort was still a trap. The diner didn't need to adapt quickly. It needed to remain forgettable. I shifted food routines slightly, using meltwater carefully. Never in ways that left residue or scent. I cleaned only when weather covered sound. I moved only when necessary. The rhythm held. At some point, I realized the diner had become something else entirely. It wasn't a refuge anymore. It was a waypoint. Not for people, but for time. A place where seasons passed without forcing action. Where the world could change around it without demanding response. That distinction freed me from the idea of permanence. I didn't need to stay forever. I only needed to stay until movement made sense again. Spring didn't mean rescue because rescue required a world that wanted to be found. This one didn't. The outbreak hadn't created chaos. It had created quiet. A quiet that punished announcement and rewarded patience. That rule hadn't expired with the snow. I stood at the window one afternoon and watched the horizon shimmer slightly in warming air. Nothing crossed it. No figures, no signals, just land returning to itself. That was when I understood the final truth of surviving the first winter. The diner didn't save me. The choices did. Staying when leaving felt tempting. Eating without evidence, heating without smoke, existing without narrative. Those decisions stacked quietly until they formed something durable enough to carry me through an entire season. Spring offered options but no instructions. It didn't promise safety. It didn't threaten danger. It simply removed one constraint and waited to see what I'd do with that freedom. I didn't rush to answer. For now, staying aligned mattered more than moving on. The diner still blended into the landscape. The road still lacked purpose. The world still punished noise. When movement returned, if it ever did, I would adapt again. The same way I always had. Slowly, quietly, without forcing the world to notice. Spring didn't mean rescue. It meant the test wasn't over. And as long as I remembered why I survived the first winter, by being irrelevant, by being patient, by being quiet, I could face whatever came next without needing anyone to announce it for me. I stayed. Not because I was trapped, but because the world still hadn't given me a reason to leave.